Hello, my name is Christopher Pramuk. I am a theologian at Regis University in Denver, Colorado. I'm delighted to be invited and honored indeed to be invited to speak with the Catholic Prison Ministries Coalition and humbled, I have to say, to be invited to speak on this topic of race and racism. I do so humbly. I don't by any means consider myself an expert. I'm still learning, still growing into my understanding. But it is a topic I have thought about for a very long time and written about and taught on. And indeed, it's a topic that cuts close to home insofar as my own family is a mixed race family, 2 children adopted from Haiti and 2 biological children. So one might say that the color line crosses right through the middle of my family. One might also say that I have skin in the game in a very personal way when it comes to race and race relations in the United States. But in truth, I think that's only half, that statement is only half true. The deeper truth is we all have skin in the game, black, white, brown. No matter your racial or ethnic background, we are called to live together in one society, in this culture, and to navigate these tensions and injustices around race that are baked into, as it were, our everyday life in this culture. The Catholic Church has a great deal to say about the topic of racial injustice and as well about mass incarceration. My goal in this short introductory video is simply to introduce myself to you, but also to invite you to consider, reflect ahead of time on 2 readings that I want to ask you to take some time with before the webinar. So let me share my screen here and just say a little bit about those 2 readings. I'll do that in just a moment. First, I want to begin with this quote that comes right off of the CPMC website, that any engagement with the reality of incarceration in the United States must involve engagement with the reality of racial injustice. That's a powerful statement. And I want to say, if you find yourself resisting this conversation or a deeper dive into issues around race and racial justice, ask yourself, where is that resistance coming from? And please, again, these 2 readings I want to share with you to do a little homework on the topic before our webinar so that we might all more or less be on the same page in terms of the language we're using, the definitions, and so forth. Going back to 2012, I just want to share this quote from Bishop Curtis Guillory, who's one of about a dozen active Black Catholic bishops in the United States. Just after the death of Trayvon Martin, the murder of Trayvon Martin by George Zimmerman, I don't think race and ethnicity have been the subject of serious dialogue. It's like you have a 2-story house where the floor upstairs is weak in some spots and unstable, so you walk around those spots, or you go very lightly across them. This is where the church can make a tremendous contribution, he said. But you have to work at it. It's not just going to happen. CPMC is clearly working at it. I was tremendously impressed with the resources that are available to you on their website. Please spend some time with those resources. Outstanding resources, challenging resources to be sure. Many of which I've spent many days and weeks and months reading, sometimes teaching those very same resources. I promise you they'll be worth your time. I also want to quote from your own Father George Williams in one of his webinars, who says something I think that if you remember nothing else, This is very important. Never lose your sense of humility. What you see during a visit to a prison or a jail is about 5% of the reality of the prison experience. You don't know and you can't know what's going on most of the time. We need to maintain, he says, a sense of holy humility. Unless you've done 20 or 30 years' time in prison yourself, you cannot fully grasp the experience of the incarcerated. A sense of holy humility. And I would maintain that that same insight applies to, more broadly, to discussions around race and racial justice in the United States. All of us are on the way, stumbling forward imperfectly, doing our best, right, to engage and understand. And so we have to give room to each other for growth. Each of us comes into the conversation from a different place in the journey that is a human life. And so the resources that I want to mention here, to my mind, are superb resources, particularly the first one. The second one is something of my own, so I don't want to violate the principle of humility in speaking of my own work. But let me begin with a book called The Politics of Mercy, just came out recently by Matthew Egemeyer and Peter Fritz, both Catholic theologians, both at Holy Cross, the College of the Holy Cross, right, in New England. And I want to share with you chapter 3 of their book, which is on mass incarceration. And they do a really nice job of framing mass incarceration in the larger context of racial injustice. Some of the questions that they will address in this chapter: what is racism and how does it manifest in different forms at both personal and structural levels? Historically, how has mass incarceration become a particularly devastating form of structural racism in the United States? So a brief snapshot of the history of the last 30 or 40 years, a veritable explosion of our prison industrial complex here in the United States, connected to the war on drugs, the so-called war on drugs in the 1980s. And how does Catholic social teaching and its advocacy for restorative justice urge us as Catholics to respond to this reality? They address prison ministry beautifully, I think, in this chapter. How does prison ministry serve as a powerful countersign to the prison industrial complex of mass incarceration, a sign of solidarity, of presence, and of hope? And finally, they provide an example of another Catholic ministry that shares with CPMC a commitment to a ministry of presence, reconciliation, and hope. Here, they close the chapter with a discussion of homeboy industries in Los Angeles. Father Greg Boyle, you may know as the Jesuit priest who started that ministry to gang members in LA. What I love about this chapter and their approach in general is Egemeyer and Fritz frame our calling to gospel courage, to gospel discipleship as a striving for the seemingly impossible. You know that as Christians, our calling is actually to try to embody the kingdom of God in this world, to hints of, if you will, incarnating a ministry of love, of mercy, of hope, and of presence, what they call a striving for the seemingly impossible in the face of the prison industrial complex. The second resource, let me just say, if there is a thesis in this chapter and in this book, it is perhaps this, that the politics of mercy, right, moving mercy into the public square, the polis, is not just possible, but actual. Not only can it be lived, it is being lived. And to be sure, prison ministry, they point to as one example of how a politics of mercy or a public commitment to mercy is being lived out by Catholics. And that is good news, very good news. And a sign of hope in our divided world today. The second resource is from my own book, Hope Sings So Beautiful, Graced Encounters Across the Color Line. And I'm suggesting just one chapter. It's not a long chapter, called Interruptions, chapter 3 of the book. And some of the questions I raise implicitly or explicitly in the chapter: to what extent is our perspective on race shaped by larger forces, whether geographical, political, ecclesial, or ideological, larger forces that in fact keep us at a comfortable distance from the lived experience of other communities, of diverse others, the lived joys, the lived hopes, the lived sufferings and struggles of other communities who are outside of our usual ken? What role have religious institutions played in race relations in the United States, for better and sometimes for worse? What might racial reconciliation look like at the grassroots from the perspective of the churches? Why do some whites and white Christians resist conversations about race and racial injustice? What factors, whether personal or societal, conscious or unconscious, make talking about race so difficult? And what are the implications of Catholic belief in the oneness of humanity, that all human beings are made in the image of God? What obstacles or fears might stand in the way of risking the cost of kinship, the cost of solidarity with those on the margins? Again, it's an invitation just to some personal reflection. If I find myself resisting some of the claims made by Egemeyer and Fritz, or by Pramuk in this chapter, by myself, to honestly look at what are some of the resistances, fears, perhaps legitimate rational disagreements with these arguments, and to reflect on those before we come together in our webinar. If there's a thesis in this chapter, I think it's a thesis that echoes one of the statements that Father George makes in one of his webinars. It has to do with prison ministry as a ministry of presence, of simply being present, and of deep listening, of being present to the incarcerated in a deep way. It seems to me that prior to any preconceived political or social agendas, simple physical presence is the greatest gift Christians can offer one another in a divided society. Just briefly, a mention of two resources that are critical to Egemeyer and Fritz. The first, The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, which has been mentioned, I think, in a number of your webinars and formational sessions. Michelle Alexander's work has also been very important in my own education, my own formation, understanding of the phenomenon of mass incarceration in the last 30, 40 years in this country. The second resource I refer to heavily in my chapter is the Jewish educator and activist Jonathan Kozol, who has written many books from the grassroots up, right? From his experience as a teacher and educator in the heart of our urban core, in the heart of our cities, in which Kozol chronicles what some have called the school to prison pipeline, right? The context out of which many people who are in our criminal justice system have more or less, by virtue of their zip codes and their race, been disproportionately disadvantaged, structured out of the benefits and successes of the American dream, or the common good, what we call in Catholic circles. Particularly his insight from the vantage point of children in our country. Profoundly moving, profoundly truthful, who has had a big impact on my own thinking about race. I want to quote Father Dustin in one of his talks for you that is recorded on the website there, we must find a way to acknowledge their grief, the grief of the incarcerated, and witness to it. Kozel makes a similar argument, simply being present to the children in our inner cities, acknowledge their grief, mourn with them, and find a way to witness to it. Why? So that we might, our hope, our freedom might be galvanized in a way to make a better possible future, right? To imagine another possibility than what is currently the reality on the ground in our country. Finally, Pope Francis has been an important influence in both of these readings on Eggemeyer and Fritz, as well as my own thinking. In Pope Francis, we find a beautiful spirituality. I would call it a spirituality of accompaniment, a ministry of presence. In life, God accompanies persons, and we must accompany them, starting with their situation. Prior to doctrine or belief or ideology, political or otherwise, Francis insists again and again what matters to God and what should matter to us the most as Christians is simply the person, the dignity, the sanctity of the person. All the theologizing in the world, says Father George, is no use unless one could be truly present with another suffering human being. And this is especially true in our ministry in prisons and jails. So let me conclude this introduction with a number of questions I want you to keep in mind as you engage with these two readings. Across these readings, what ideas, images, stories, statistics do you find most helpful, surprising, challenging? Does anything in the two readings elicit disagreement, resistance, or strong discomfort? What is the source of the discomfort? Is there something it can teach you? Both readings offer an explicitly Catholic perspective on issues of racial injustice. What do you make of the author's treatment of racial justice and reconciliation through the lens of Catholic faith and Catholic social teachings? I do not expect you to agree with everything in my chapter or in Eggemeyer and Fritz by any means, but I do ask you to have an open mind, to engage the presentations with openness and thoughtfulness, jot down your objections, your questions, anything, and we'll be sure to have some time during the webinar to respond to those, to address any of those questions you may have. A little bit more personally, I would ask you to reflect back on your own history, your own story, your own life experience. When did you personally first become aware of racial difference, racial inequality, or racial segregation in society or in the church? I'll say more about that in my own personal experience growing up in a very 100% white church environment, white neighborhood. I'll say more about my own background during the webinar, but I just would ask you to look at your own background, your own experience. How did that new awareness, if you will, of racial difference, inequality, or segregation, when you first became aware of it, how did it impact you? When you look back at that experience, did any grace or positive growth arise from it? Are there forms of privilege, of social blindness or myopia? What is myopia? Kind of nearsightedness, just an awareness of things that are familiar to me, but not so much an awareness of things over there in the distance. Are there forms of privilege, social blindness, or myopia that I might benefit from, consciously or not, based on my life experience, education, or racial and cultural identity? Can the recognition of my own social privilege, even if that recognition is painful, can it actually be a force, a positive force for good, a grace, for myself or for others. So thank you for, again, for tuning in to this introduction to your readings. I really look forward to our webinar together. My plan is to offer you a presentation of about 40-45 minutes at the very most. And then our last 20 or 30 minutes, I think we're scheduled for 75 minutes, we'll just open the floor and I'll engage with your questions, and we'll just have some open conversations based on the readings and based on my presentation in the first part of the webinar. God bless you. I truly admire the work that you've committed to yourself to in this work of prison ministry, and I hope that what I have to offer will be of some benefit. Thank you. God bless.